John Murray entered the Texas prison system long before his name became permanently fused with one of the most feared white supremacist organizations in American correctional history. In the late 1970s, Texas prisons were sealed worlds governed by unwritten rules, racial boundaries, and informal power brokers who operated in the shadows of official authority. Murray did not arrive as a visionary or a prophet of extremist ideology. He arrived as a condemned man, sentenced to life in prison in 1979 for the attempted homicide of a police officer, a crime that ensured he would grow old behind razor wire and concrete walls. From the moment the steel doors closed behind him, Murray was forced to adapt to an environment where survival demanded allegiance, silence, and an instinct for power. At that time, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice was still shaped by traditions that dated back decades. Racial segregation was not merely tolerated, it was institutionalized. White inmates lived with whites, black inmates with blacks, Hispanic inmates with Hispanics. Order was enforced through the notorious building tender system, where select prisoners acted as enforcers for guards, rewarded with authority, privileges, and protection. Violence was omnipresent, but it was controlled, delegated, and often hidden behind bureaucratic indifference. Men were slayed in cell blocks and shower rooms, their homicides written off as unavoidable consequences of incarceration. For inmates like Murray, this brutal equilibrium was the only reality they knew. That equilibrium began to fracture just as Murray was settling into his life sentence. In 1980, the federal courts ruled in Lamar versus Caulfield that Texas prisons could no longer remain racially segregated. The decision dismantled decades of routine practice almost overnight. White inmates were suddenly housed alongside black and Hispanic prisoners, many of whom already belonged to emerging ethnic-based gangs. The building tender system collapsed under legal scrutiny, stripping guards of their inmate proxies and leaving a dangerous vacuum of authority. Chaos followed. Protection became a currency, and fear became the dominant language spoken behind the walls. For white inmates, the desegregation of Texas prisons felt like exposure without armor. Many had relied on racial separation for safety, and with its removal came uncertainty and panic. It was within this volatile atmosphere that John Murray began to take shape, not merely as a prisoner, but as an organizer. He watched as ethnic gangs tightened their internal discipline and expanded their influence, offering structure in exchange for loyalty. Murray understood something fundamental about prison life. Men do not seek ideology first, they seek survival. Ideology comes later, often as a justification for the violence required to maintain control. Murray gravitated toward other white inmates who shared his sense that the old rules were gone and new ones would have to be written in blood. Among them were men who admired the reputation of the Aryan Brotherhood originating in California, a group whose name alone inspired fear across multiple prison systems. The California Aryan Brotherhood had built its power on rigid hierarchy, absolute loyalty, and ritualized homicide as a tool of governance. For Murray and his peers, that model represented stability in a system unraveling at its seams. It also represented opportunity. Yet Murray was not yet the architect of anything. He was learning, observing, absorbing the rhythms of prison violence and the psychology of men trapped with nothing left to lose. He saw how quickly weak alliances collapsed and how swiftly inmates were slaughtered when they stood alone. He learned that reputation mattered as much as action, and that silence could be as powerful as brutality. Murray's life sentence freed him from the fear of additional time, a reality that hardened his resolve and made him more dangerous in the eyes of both inmates and guards. As desegregation intensified, spontaneous violence erupted across Texas units. Unaffiliated white inmates were easy targets, slayed by organized groups who enforced racial or territorial dominance. The absence of a centralized white power structure left many exposed. Murray recognized that fear created demand, and demand created authority. Protection, once informal, could be systematized. Violence, once reactive, could be strategic. What was missing was organization. Murray's criminal conviction had already marked him as a man capable of extreme action. Inside prison, that reputation evolved. He was not known for impulsive outbursts, but for calculated restraint. He understood that indiscriminate homicide attracted unwanted attention, while selective violence sent a clearer message. This distinction would later define the organization he helped shape. At this stage, however, Murray was simply positioning himself, gathering trust, and testing loyalties in a rapidly shifting environment. The collapse of the building tender system further accelerated the rise of inmate-led governance. Guards, stripped of their informal enforcers, often retreated into passive supervision. Entire housing units became self-regulating ecosystems where dominance was earned through intimidation and bloodshed. Murray watched as power flowed to those who could organize violence without chaos. He understood that leadership in prison was less about charisma and more about consistency. Men followed those who could guarantee protection and deliver retribution without hesitation. By the early 1980s, Murray had become part of a small but determined circle of white inmates who believed that survival required unity and structure. They were not yet the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, but the blueprint was forming. These men discussed hierarchy, discipline, and the necessity of enforcing loyalty through irrevocable acts. In prison culture, nothing binds men together like shared guilt. Participation in a slaying was not merely an act of violence. It was a contract written in blood, ensuring silence and obedience. This period marked the transformation of John Murray from a solitary lifer into a foundational figure of something far larger. His rise was not sudden or dramatic. It was methodical, shaped by institutional failure and racial upheaval. The Texas prison system had unintentionally created the conditions for organized extremism by removing old controls without replacing them with effective alternatives. Murray simply stepped into the void. By the end of this chapter, John Murray was no longer just an inmate serving a life sentence. He was a man positioned at the intersection of fear, violence, and opportunity. The stage was set for the birth of a new organization, one that would cloak itself in white supremacist symbolism while operating as a ruthless criminal enterprise. What began as a response to chaos was about to become a permanent force within Texas prisons, and John Murray would be at its center. By the early 1980s, the violence inside Texas prisons was no longer random. It was directional. Groups were forming, lines were being drawn, and men who failed to choose a side were routinely slayed as examples. John Murray and a small cadre of white inmates understood that neutrality was a death sentence. They also understood that imitation alone would not guarantee survival. The California-based Aryan Brotherhood loomed large in prison mythology, its reputation built on disciplined brutality and unwavering loyalty. Murray and his associates believed that aligning themselves with that legacy could instantly confer legitimacy and deterrence. Initial efforts were made to affiliate with the California Aryan Brotherhood, to become a Texas extension of an already feared brand. Messages were passed through inmate channels, reputations were vouched for, and intentions were made clear. But the response that came back was definitive and dismissive. The California leadership rejected the idea of a Texas affiliate, unwilling to share authority or dilute control. For Murray, the rejection was not a defeat, it was a catalyst. If Texas whites could not be sanctioned, they would be sovereign. Around 1981, the decision was made to form an independent organization, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. And it was not announced with banners or proclamations. It emerged quietly through whispered agreements, coded language, and acts of coordinated violence. Murray, alongside figures such as Harry Wagner, helped define the group's foundational principles. At its core was a rigid hierarchy designed to prevent fragmentation. Orders flowed downward, discipline flowed upward, and loyalty was enforced through irreversible acts. The ABT adopted white supremacist ideology as its public face, but beneath the symbolism lay a far more pragmatic agenda. Racism provided unity and justification, but power came from control of resources and fear. Murray understood that ideology alone could not sustain an organization inside prison. Men might chant slogans, but they followed strength. To that end, the ABT quickly established itself as a protection-based organization. White inmates who feared being slaughtered by rival groups were offered safety in exchange for obedience. Membership was not granted lightly. Prospects were observed, tested, and pressured. The final threshold was violence. The blood in, blood out rule was not ceremonial. It was operational. To enter the ABT, a recruit had to participate in a slaying sanctioned by leadership. This act bound the member permanently to the group, ensuring silence and loyalty. To leave, only death was permitted. Murray supported this structure not out of sadism, but out of necessity. In his view, an organization that tolerated weakness would collapse under pressure. As the ABT solidified, its presence spread across multiple Texas prison units. Murray's role was less about daily enforcement and more about strategic alignment. He helped standardize rules, define ranks, and establish communication protocols. Violence was used selectively, aimed at rivals or internal threats. Random brutality was discouraged because it attracted attention and destabilized operations. This distinction separated the ABT from less disciplined gangs, whose members often acted on impulse and paid for it with their lives. The desegregation ruling that had initially created chaos now worked in the ABT's favor. Mixed housing meant proximity to rivals, and proximity meant opportunity. The ABT demonstrated its willingness to slay when challenged, quickly earning a reputation that traveled faster than official records. In prison, reputation is protection. Men who heard stories of swift, calculated homicides thought twice before crossing the group. Guards, overwhelmed and understaffed, often responded after the damage was done. Murray's influence during this period was rooted in credibility. His life sentence insulated him from leverage, and his measured approach to violence signaled authority. He was not the loudest voice, but his opinions carried weight. He emphasized discipline, warning that reckless homicide would invite lockdowns and investigations. The goal, as Murray saw it, was longevity. The ABT was not meant to burn bright and collapse. It was meant to endure. As the organization matured, its activities expanded beyond mere protection. Control of contraband became a priority. Drugs, weapons, and information flowed through ABT channels, strengthening its grip on the prison economy. Violence became transactional. A slaying could be ordered as punishment, deterrence, or debt collection. Each act reinforced the group's authority and reminded both members and rivals of the consequences of defiance. The ABT's internal culture mirrored a military unit. Orders were absolute, disobedience was fatal, and loyalty was constantly tested. Murray helped shape this culture, believing that structure was the only defense against infiltration and betrayal. Informants were hunted relentlessly, and suspected cooperators were slayed without hesitation. Fear was not just a weapon, it was a shield. By the mid-1980s, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas had become a permanent fixture within the TDCJ. Its name carried weight, its members moved with confidence, and its enemies were cautious. What began as a response to institutional collapse had evolved into a disciplined organization capable of sustained violence. Murray had helped turn vulnerability into dominance, filling the void left by the state with an inmate-run system of order enforced by blood. Yet even as the ABT rose, the seeds of future conflict were being planted. Expansion brought new members, and new members brought differing motives. Some were drawn by ideology, others by profit, others by the simple desire to avoid being slaughtered. Murray would later reflect that this diversity of motivation diluted discipline. But during this founding era, cohesion held. The ABT was unified by fear, loyalty, and the shared understanding that survival depended on obedience. By the end of this act, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas was no longer an idea. It was an institution. John Murray had moved from observer to architect, helping construct a gang that would outlive his direct influence. The foundation had been laid, and the machinery of violence was in motion. What remained was to see how that machinery would evolve once profit and ambition began to rival ideology as driving forces. As the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas matured, its identity began to shift in ways even its founders could not fully control. What started as a survival-based alliance wrapped in white supremacist symbolism evolved into something colder and far more calculating. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the ABT was no longer defined primarily by race. It was defined by revenue, discipline, and the efficient use of violence. Ideology remained the banner, but profit became the engine. Inside Texas prisons, power no longer came merely from fear. It came from control of the underground economy. Drugs became the lifeblood of the organization. Narcotics flowed through prison units with surprising regularity, moved by corrupt staff, visitors, and street associates. The ABT positioned itself as both distributor and enforcer, taxing independent dealers and eliminating competition. Those who resisted were slayed swiftly, their homicides staged as warnings rather than impulsive acts. Violence was no longer just about dominance, it was about maintaining market stability. In this transformation, the ABT began to resemble a syndicate more than a gang. John Murray watched this evolution from inside the same walls that had birthed the organization. His role had changed. Where once he helped define structure and discipline, he now observed as new leaders rose, men more interested in money than cohesion. Murray later described this period as the beginning of intellectual decline. In his view, strategy was being replaced by impulse, and long-term survival was being sacrificed for short-term gain. Still, the machinery he helped build continued to function with lethal efficiency. The ABT's hierarchy expanded to accommodate its growing operations. Rank determined access to profits, authority to order violence, and control over external connections. Orders moved through a chain of command that mimicked military organization. Slayings were approved at the top and executed at the bottom, insulating leadership from direct exposure. This structure made the group resilient. When one member was removed through isolation, transfer, or homicide, another stepped seamlessly into place. Internal discipline grew harsher as stakes increased. Paranoia became a constant companion. Suspected informants were interrogated, tested, and often slaughtered on little more than suspicion. The blood in, blood out rule, once a mechanism for loyalty, became a tool of terror within the ranks. Members understood that survival depended not just on obedience, but on anticipation, on proving loyalty before it was questioned. Fear kept the organization intact, even as its moral center eroded. The ABT's influence extended beyond prison walls through coordinated street activity. Associates on the outside carried out robberies, intimidation, and homicide-for-hire schemes tied directly to prison orders. This blurred the line between incarceration and freedom, allowing the organization to project power across Texas. For law enforcement, this presented a growing challenge. Investigations stalled as witnesses disappeared, recanted, or were found slayed under suspicious circumstances. Despite its growing notoriety, the ABT generally avoided targeting high-ranking law enforcement or prosecutors. Murray would later emphasize that this restraint was intentional. The organization's traditional business model favored low-profile violence that minimized federal attention. Slaying rival inmates or internal threats was one thing. Provoking a full-scale response from state and federal authorities was another. This unwritten rule helped the ABT operate for years with relative impunity. That calculus was tested repeatedly as individual members pursued personal vendettas. Internal revenge killings increased, destabilizing units and drawing scrutiny. Murray viewed these acts as evidence that the organization had lost its strategic discipline. Violence, once deliberate, was becoming emotional. The ABT was still powerful, but its cohesion was weakening under the weight of greed and ego. By the early 2000s, federal investigators had begun to map the ABT's structure in unprecedented detail. Wiretaps, informants, and intercepted communications painted a picture of a sprawling criminal enterprise rooted in prison, but branching far beyond it. Murray, though not charged in the major sweeps that followed, became an unexpected source of insight. Having distanced himself from daily operations, he provided context on hierarchy, rituals, and enforcement methods. His cooperation was pragmatic rather than redemptive, a recognition that the organization he helped found had become something dangerous even to its own creators. Murray warned investigators that pressure on the ABT often produced unpredictable reactions. Crackdowns created power struggles, and power struggles bred violence. He noted that federal cases injected what he called new energy into the group, an unstable mix of fear and aggression that could spill outward. This insight proved prescient. As leadership was disrupted, some members grew more reckless, embracing extremism over calculation. The most publicized violence linked to the ABT shocked even seasoned observers. While Murray maintained that such acts were deviations rather than doctrine, they underscored how far the organization had drifted from its original intent. What began as a mechanism for survival had become a vehicle for unchecked brutality. The ABT no longer needed justification. Violence had become its own currency. Inside prison, the consequences were devastating. Entire housing units lived under the shadow of potential slaughter. Inmates navigated daily life through alliances in silence, knowing that a single misstep could lead to homicide. Guards, overwhelmed and cautious, often intervened only after blood had been spilled. The ABT thrived in this environment, feeding off fear and institutional inertia. For John Murray, this era marked a personal reckoning. He had helped construct the framework that allowed such violence to flourish. Though he criticized the intelligence and discipline of newer members, he could not escape responsibility for the system itself. The Syndicate had grown beyond any one man's control, sustained by profit, paranoia, and the normalization of homicide as governance. By the close of this act, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas stood as one of the most entrenched, prison-based criminal organizations in the United States. Its evolution from ideological gang to profit-driven syndicate was complete. The question was no longer how it rose, but how or if it could ever be dismantled. And looming over that question was the legacy of John Murray, a founder who now watched from the margins as his creation consumed everything around it. By the time federal pressure intensified, John Murray was no longer a commander issuing orders or shaping daily operations. Age, time, and disillusionment had shifted his position within the prison hierarchy. He remained incarcerated under the same life sentence imposed decades earlier, but his relationship with the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas had changed fundamentally. The organization he helped build no longer reflected the discipline or strategic restraint he once considered essential. What he now saw was an entity driven by impulse, profit, and internal revenge, a force that devoured its own members as readily as its enemies. Murray began to distance himself openly from the ABT, a rare and dangerous stance for a man so closely associated with its origins. Disassociation in prison culture is never clean. It invites suspicion, retaliation, and isolation. Yet Murray persisted, later stating that many contemporary members lacked foresight and intelligence, operating more like opportunistic criminals than disciplined operators. In his view, the ABT had abandoned longevity for chaos. Violence was no longer a calculated tool, it was reflexive. Slayings occurred not to preserve order, but to settle petty disputes and inflate reputations. This period of separation coincided with some of the most aggressive federal actions ever taken against the ABT. Sweeping indictments targeted leadership, street associates, and financial pipelines. The goal was not merely to punish individual crimes, but to dismantle the organization's command structure. Murray, though not a defendant in the most prominent cases, became a valuable source of institutional memory. He understood how the ABT thought, how it recruited, and how it enforced loyalty. That knowledge, accumulated over decades, proved critical. Murray's cooperation with investigators was pragmatic rather than confessional. He did not portray himself as redeemed, nor did he deny his role in creating the organization. Instead, he provided clarity. He explained the military-style hierarchy, the ritualized oaths, and the operational logic behind sanctioned homicide. He described how blood in, blood out functioned not as symbolism, but as a permanent tether binding members through shared culpability. In doing so, Murray helped authorities decode a system that thrived on secrecy and fear. He also offered warnings. According to Murray, large federal cases often destabilized gangs rather than immediately neutralizing them. Removing leadership created power vacuums, and power vacuums invited reckless ambition. He observed that intense scrutiny injected what he called new energy into the ABT, an unstable mix of paranoia and aggression. Members fearing exposure or betrayal sometimes lashed out, authorizing slayings that violated long-standing internal norms. In this sense, enforcement pressure could temporarily increase violence before reducing it. Murray's insights gained public attention following high-profile homicides linked to extremist violence in Texas. When Kaufman County prosecutors were slaughtered in 2013, The brutality shocked the nation. Murray spoke publicly in the aftermath, careful with his words but firm in his assessment. He acknowledged that the ABT was capable of extreme violence, yet emphasized that such high-level targeting was not consistent with the group's traditional business approach. In his view, the act represented deviation, an escalation fueled by radicalization and loss of control rather than organizational logic. These statements underscored the central irony of Murray's legacy. He had helped design a system meant to regulate violence, yet that same system eventually produced acts beyond regulation. The ABT no longer required founders to guide it. It operated autonomously, sustained by fear, profit, and the normalization of homicide as conflict resolution. Murray could critique its evolution, but he could not undo its foundation. Inside prison, Murray's life narrowed. He remained a known figure, respected by some, resented by others, and watched closely by staff. His parole reviews came and went, each denial reinforcing the permanence of his sentence. In March 2025, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice again denied parole to Anthony John Murray, citing the severity of his offense and ongoing concerns. His next review, scheduled for March 2026, loomed as another procedural milestone rather than a realistic possibility of release. Time weighed heavily on Murray, but it also clarified his perspective. In later interviews, he spoke less about ideology and more about consequence. He described how organizations like the ABT exploit institutional failure, filling voids left by understaffed, overwhelmed systems. He did not excuse the violence, he contextualized it. In doing so, he shifted the narrative from individual evil to systemic breakdown, arguing that prisons themselves can incubate extremism when order collapses. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas continues to exist, fragmented yet persistent, adapting to enforcement strategies and internal losses. Its influence has waned in some areas and hardened in others. Younger members, lacking the historical context of its formation, often pursue notoriety over stability. Murray's criticisms echo through this evolution, a reminder that even the most ruthless systems require discipline to survive.